the summer of 1259, the most powerful man on earth was losing a war. Not to an empire, not to an army, to a town, on a rock, in the mountains of southwest China. They called his people the Scourge of God, the whip in heaven's hand, sent to punish the world. For 50 years, the Mongols had ridden across the earth and left it in ash. Korea, to the gates of Europe. Almost nothing had stopped them, not walls, not armies, not kings. And now their war machine had broken against a single cliff, and the man who ruled a third of the world was about to die beneath it. What that death unleashed, half a world away, no one in that town would ever know. To understand the rock, you have to understand the flood. It began with one man, Genghis Khan. From a handful of horsemen on the steppe, he forged the deadliest war machine in human history. By the 1250s, his heirs ruled the largest contiguous land empire in history, from the Pacific to the edge of Europe, roughly 1/6 of the world's land. When a city resisted, they erased it. Every man, every woman, every child. And now the empire had a new master, Möngke Khan, grandson of Genghis, the most powerful man alive. Möngke had a plan to take the rest. He sent his brothers to the ends of the earth. His brother Hulagu, west, into the heart of Islam. His brother Kublai, east. And the hardest prize, Möngke kept for himself. Song China, the richest, most sophisticated empire on earth, and the last great realm in the east, still free of Mongol rule. He would take it through Sichuan. He did not know that Sichuan was where the flood would meet a wall it could not climb. The Mongols had been bleeding into Sichuan for 20 years. They had sacked its greatest city, Chengdu. By some accounts, the province lost millions. On the open plain, the horse was king, and on the plain, the Song lost. So the Song stopped trying to win the Mongols' war. One commander made the boldest bet of all. Don't fight cavalry where cavalry wins. Fight it where a horse is useless. Straight up. He would turn the mountains of Sichuan into a chain of fortresses, and the keystone would sit on a flat-topped mountain where 3 rivers meet. The Chinese called it Diaoyu, Fishing Mountain. In 1243, they built it. Understand what they built, because this is the whole story. Cliffs on every side, dropping sheer to the water, no slope for a horse, no wall a ram could reach, and on top, not a bare rock, but a world. More than 2 square kilometers of farmland, fields, springs, wells, ponds thick with fish. A fortress that grew its own grain, built so it could never be starved out. You could not storm it, you could not ride into it, you could not starve it. A castle that fought like a mountain. Inside it, soldiers and farmers, tens of thousands of them, and 2 men who would not kneel. A commander and his deputy. They had built a trap. All they needed was for the flood to walk into it. In February 1259 it did. Möngke came in person. The Khan of Khans, who had crushed everything from Persia to the Pacific, rode up to a mountain town and expected it to take days. He sent an envoy to demand surrender. The commander had him executed. So the siege began, and it would last 5 months. The Mongols hit the gates held. They raided in the dark. The cliffs swallowed them. They threw the deadliest army on earth at a wall of stone, and the stone threw it back. This was Sichuan in summer. The rains came, the rivers rose, and the mountains turned to mud. The horse, the weapon that had conquered the world, was useless on a vertical cliff and dying in the mire below. Heat, damp, rot, disease swept the camp. The deadliest cavalry on earth sat at the foot of a rock they could not climb and began to die. of fever, of sickness, of despair. A top Mongol general rode close to call for surrender. A stone from the wall struck him down. Days later, he was dead. And the strangest thing began to happen. It was the besiegers who were starving, not the besieged. And from the top of the rock, the defenders laughed. By local tradition, they threw 2 enormous fresh fish and a pile of steamed cakes over the wall, down to the starving army below, with a note, "Come back in 10 years, we will still be here." The scourge of God was being bled white by a town on a cliff, and Möngke had had enough. He ordered a great platform built on the heights to look down into the fortress and direct the kill himself. But the commander had already aimed his artillery at exactly that spot. As the Chinese histories tell it, the most powerful man on earth stepped up onto the platform, and the town opened fire. On the 11th of August 1259, Möngke Khan was dead. The histories argue over how. A stone, an arrow, a fever in the camp. They agree only on this. His death came out of a failed siege of a town on a rock. In every conquest, across half the world, the Mongols had never lost their Khan. Here, they lost him. A stone killed a Khan, and a dead Khan stopped the world. Because Mongol law was iron. When the Great Khan died, the princes of the blood turned for home and the throne. And so the greatest war machine on earth simply stopped. In the east, his brother Kublai broke off his own campaign and raced north into civil war with another brother. The empire turned its swords on itself. And far to the west, the third brother got the news. Hulegu. 2 years before, Hulegu had reached Baghdad. For 500 years, the jewel of the Muslim world, the seat of the Caliph. He took it in days. By later accounts, his men burned the great libraries, and the Tigris ran black with the ink of 1,000,000 books, and red with the blood of the people. The Caliph himself, by one account, they rolled in a carpet and trampled under their horses. A 500-year empire, gone in days. And now Hulegu stood in Syria with that same army driving on Egypt, the last gate before Africa, before the Mediterranean, before a Europe with no army left to stop him. 18 years earlier, the Mongols had already smashed Poland and Hungary and reached the very edge of Europe, and, by the old accounts, the death of another Khan called them home. Now it happened again. Hulegu turned around. He pulled the bulk of his host back east toward his own lands, leaving only a fraction of his army behind. On the 3rd of September 1260, that remnant met Egypt's slave soldiers, the Mamluks, at a desert spring in Galilee called Ain Jalut. And there, for the first time in the West, the Mongols were beaten. A defeat they would never reverse. The tide that had swallowed the world stopped at a well in the desert. Egypt survived, Syria survived, Islam survived, and the Mongols would never again come close to Africa or the heart of the West. Some historians have argued that the line runs all the way back to a rock in China, a Khan who died at a town he could not take, an army that turned for home and never came back. By some accounts, a fortress most of the world has never heard of helped decide the fate of the Middle East and of Europe, a town that would never know. Later, it earned a name, the place where God's whip was broken. But the rock's own story was not over, and its ending is the darkest part of all. The town that broke an empire did not fall in battle. It outlived its own country. For 20 more years it held. Its deputy, who had stood on these walls from the first day, fought on to the end. When the region's great walled capital, Chongqing, finally fell, he was taken, and he killed himself rather than kneel. And then, in 1279, far to the south, the last of the Song made their final stand at sea, at Yashan. When the line broke, a minister took the boy emperor of China onto his back and walked off the side of the ship into the sea. By some accounts, 100,000 bodies floated in the water. The Song dynasty was gone. And the fortress on Fishing Mountain was now guarding a country that no longer existed. Its last commander looked at the thousands still inside, soldiers, farmers, children, and made a choice. He would surrender, on one condition, that not a single person inside would be harmed. The conquerors agreed. After 36 years, the gates opened without a final battle. And then, by local tradition, 32 of its defending generals refused to live in a world the Mongols had won. One by one, they turned their swords on themselves. The town that killed a Khan ended with its heroes dead by their own hands, having won the only promise that ever mattered. Not one of their people would die. An empire drowned the world, and it broke on a rock where men caught fish. Welcome to the Dragon Files. Subscribe for more.